And then there's been some that were really, really loving and kind, and they could accept me. But it's actually quite rare, actually. If you're religious, it's very hard to accept someone that says, I know what you follow, and I've decided to leave it, because it creates so many of your own internal doubts.
Hi, Imtiaz.
Hey, James, how are you doing?
Yeah, good, mate. How are you?
Yeah, good. I'm in my house. I'm usually in my office, but I'm in my house today. And I have my first dinner outside happening tonight.
Exciting.
Yeah.
Weird time. Such a
Weird.
statement's necessary. Well, thanks so much for coming on the podcast, and hopefully this will be an episode that loads of people who listen to this will learn a lot about you and a lot about what work you do. You and I, we've been mates for a little while, and I think what you do is so important and so cool, and that's kind of why I've invited you on. But talk to me about, the first question I have is, what is Faith to Faithless? You're the co-founder or the founder, aren't you? The co-founder of Faith to Faithless.
Co-founder, yeah. Faith to Faithless is a response to my problems. So when I was younger, 7 years ago now, where I grew up quite religious, I left Islam. I didn't know you could leave it. Basically, I thought, I thought I was the only person out of like 1.7 billion people who had left.
Right.
And, that's not a good place to be in. And then recognizing there's other people like me who went through the same thing, kind of helping them, I guess. But then in a wider way, recognizing there's lots of people like us, like Jehovah's Witnesses who leave, Hasidic Jewish people who leave, evangelical Christians, going through not always the same, but often very, very similar problems. And so Faith to Faithless was created first to give a voice, but actually eventually, especially when it got taken into Humanist UK, which I'm now a trustee of, more also about the kind of infrastructure of our world, like the governments, the social services. How do we talk to them about apostasy, and how do we make sure that they're aware of these problems? Because otherwise they perpetuate some of the same structures that create problems for people like me and other apostates. So it was very much a response to something I went through.
Great. For those, I'm sure most people will know what apostasy is, but could you just tell me quickly go into the detail?
The horrible word that basically means
left
religion, right? And this is the problem. So when we do training with social workers, often when we say the word apostate, one question will come up saying, well, why do you use that word? It's a horrible word. And it's like, exactly. What word is there? Ex-religious. If we say ex-Muslim or ex-Christian, it sounds horrible, even worse, and people don't like the word ex-Muslim or ex-Christian. And then you look at ex-religious, again, it sounds like you're because this group or these groups have been so discriminated, even the language to describe us is bad. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
We often obviously say, okay, we've ref religion, but what are we now? So sometimes we might be humanists, and we definitely use that a lot. In my case, I am a humanist, but that tear that happens when you leave, there's no nice way to describe it. It's horrible.
No. It's the same with the word atheist as well, isn't it? Because you're defining yourself by the lack of the thing that you've left, as opposed to a positive thing that describes your essence. It's weird, isn't it? Yeah.
And it's a response to the structure of society, because if the structure of society assumed everyone was non-religious until you're religious, you wouldn't have the word atheist. Same thing with, you'd argue the same for feminism. Like, if you argue that feminism is equality, because the word is unequal, you have to use a word like feminism. And obviously that riles some people up as well. It's the same thing where it's like there's an unequalness in society, which means that the bog standard, leaving that bog standard in any way is a uneasy thing, like apostasy. So that's why we use that word, because there is no word that's better to use.
There's no better word.
Nice.
No.
Yeah, there's no better word.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So you touched on your motivations for founding the group, which were basically there was no one around to help you. Is Faith to Faithless in a space on its own, or are there other groups that you work with that sort of work with apostates?
Yeah, it's very interesting. So there were, like, before Faith to Faithless, there were sort of lots of little community or activist groups around doing little things. There were a couple of really good big ones that were very specialized. Like in the US, you have Footsteps, which deals with ex-Hasidic Jews, particularly in New York.
Okay.
And then, there was ex-Mormon community groups as well. But I would say it was the first, like, cross-apostasy group that was very focused on community and action. Yeah. There was other foundations like the Freedom from Religion Foundation, which do quite well in the US, but they're very US focused, right? So Faith to Faithless was trying to move towards more like a globalized approach to this, even though it's UK focused.
Okay.
The UK is so diverse, we actually do end up having a lot of these issues across multi-ethnic and multi-gender and multi-LGBT type stuff. So, it was the first, I would say, cross apostasy charity project that really touched on a lot of the issues at the highest level that you saw across multiple apostasy groups, whether you're ex-Jehovah's Witness, ex-Christian, etc.
Yeah. Well, when I was living in Exeter a few years ago, I set up a humanist group, and we had faith-to-faith speakers come down and talk to us. And the ones that I thought were just outstanding speakers, and it just blew my mind listening to them, were the ex-Jehovah's Witness.
Yeah, they're so good.
Guys, really, really.
But it makes sense, James, because they were trained to preach. Don't forget.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? That they've got such good public speaking abilities. Yeah.
I mean, I used to always make this joke, kind of slightly tongue in cheek, but kind of real, which is that our best volunteers are ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, because they spent their whole life learning how to talk, how to knock on doors, how to make sales. That's what they do. And so directing some of that energy is like the biggest weakness for the Jehovah's Witness church, because you suddenly have this very, very motivated and committed group of ex-Jehovah's Witnesses. It's quite fun.
Yeah. But I was going to ask you, so like, I can understand the need for a group like yours in, say, America, where religion is very dominant, or in countries where religion is still very dominant. But in the UK, I mean, obviously, I went to a Church of England school, which is a very kind of, I mean, you might call it benign. I don't know if if all humanists would agree with that, but my own personal experience was I never felt like I had to leave religion. It was just a very natural kind of, I just kind of thought it was bullshit after a while sort of thing. And I never felt as though I was going to be persecuted, or that I was going to be in danger, or that I was going to lose my social group. So why is there a need for faith to faithless in the UK? Are there lots of people in a position where they're either in danger, or they're going to be persecuted or ostracized?
And so just to start with, what do we count as problems for apostates? So often, particularly with ex-Muslims, when you talk about apostasy, people are like, oh my God, have you had death threats? And yes, there's an absolute core threat there, that particularly if you live in the Muslim countries, but that's not the day-to-day lived problems that a lot of ex-Muslims face. The problems are much more about communal shame, about being homeless, about your future, your choices around relationships, and the gender you choose to be, or who you date. These are the life problems that people go through their whole lives as an apostate, if you're not careful. So, it's a big, wide gamut of problems. Now, in terms of how big this problem is in the UK, part of the problem in the UK is that we're very a-religious, right? Even the religious sort of benign schools they seem chill, which means that it's easy to ignore the problems. I'll give you an example. There's 2.7 million Muslims in the UK approximately, right? That's a lot of people where fundamentally the orthodoxy does not allow leaving. For all of them. I can't imagine a single Muslim in the UK who could leave publicly on social media to their parents and just not believe in a public way and not have problems. Big problems, right? Not a single person. And when I talk to Muslims who say, "Why are you talking about it? Why not just leave?" I say, "Cool, leave Islam for a week. Do it publicly." And all of them shut up usually after that, because it's a very obvious thing once you think about it. And then, so that's 2.7 million people just there. Then you've got Jehovah's Witnesses, which there's only a couple of 100,000, but it's essentially a cult, which means you can't leave it. If you leave it, you lose your mum, your dad, your kids, you lose everything, right? We have letters from mothers to their children saying, "I love you, but Jesus means I can't talk to you anymore," right? So, okay, it's only a couple of 100,000, but it's a couple of 100,000 where the trauma is higher than some of the biggest things we have in the UK in terms of trauma. Then you've got the Hasidic Jewish population, which again, it's only a couple of 100,000. But again, there are literally leaflets in the community saying, when people are leaving our faith, they're taking our golden children with them. So they're doing £1 million campaigns to raise money to sue the parents of the kids who are leaving their faith, in order for the kids to be taken away from them. Wow. And in the Hasidic community, often there's a lot of pressure to have lots of children. And so you do have big families, and you can lose your kids. And so it's a running, not a joke, but it's a running theme that the men are always in court cases to try to get the kids back, you know? So these are the kind of problems in the UK, which, as you say, is a reasonably chill country. So imagine what it's like in the rest of the world, right?
Yeah.
And then and to be honest, I agreed with you in the past that, oh, UK doesn't have a Christianity problem. But actually, because it's so benign, you end up with a sliver, but a reasonably large sliver of evangelicals where it's a big problem. And then let's not even talk about Ireland, because that's a whole thing. But there's a sliver of Christianity which is very evangelical. And I had a 84-year-old lady come to me in Wales saying, I know you guys are talking about Jehovah's Witness and Muslim, and it's very difficult, but I'm worried that my daughter and my daughter and my grandson will stop talking to me if they realize I'm a humanist and non-religious believing. And she's an 84-year-old Christian lady, but because she's from a slightly more religious family, that's what she's worried about, right?
Yeah. No, I mean that's a brilliant answer, really, to the question, isn't it? Because I think there's a lot of people in my situation, particularly of my generation, where atheism is the norm. We don't really know many religious people our age, not really, certainly not Christian. We might have Muslim mates but it's just not something on our radar. We don't really think about these things. But when
sorry, just to say, if you ask your mates who don't believe this is a problem, often the touch point is when someone they know tried to date someone from one of these communities, like a Muslim boy or girl. That's often when you hear about the issues for the first time.
Yeah, that is true. And I have actually got an anecdote just like that. Yeah, interestingly. Exactly. So I was going to ask you, what support does Faith to Faithless actually give people in terms of, if someone was to come to you? I mean, obviously there are people come to you with different problems, different stages in their life, maybe from different places in the country. But just give me an example of maybe the 2 or 3 top things that you deal with day to day as a charity, and how you help people.
Yeah. First thing is just outreach, because often these people don't know people exist who leave, right? So like I said in the beginning, I didn't know. So we have a bunch of YouTube videos with, if you add them up, millions of views. We have some documentaries that were done like with Vice and Guardian and whatever. And
where can people find those?
If you just go on Vice and look for Rescuing Ex-Muslims, that's one that I was in. Cool. And then there was one for The Economist that Alia was in. There was just a number of documentaries. Just look for Faith to Faithless. Yeah, it'll come up. The Vice one is like the most well-known one, I would say, but it's.
I'll include it in the link when we put it.
Yeah, but that's very specific to ex-Muslims, though. Like the Faith to Faithless work is wider. But yeah, and then if you go on Google and you look for Faith to Faithless, you'll find our videos. There's lots of them in our channel. And you can hear some of the stories. So that's the first one, right? Just the outreach. And the good thing about the outreach is we have the tools to do all of that. YouTube, what we're doing here, podcasting. And so people can continuously feel less alone when they watch these videos. Yeah. The second thing we do is community. So particularly with some of the likes of Terry and Steve, who are our ex-Jehovah's Witness board members and volunteers, they're very good at socials. And so there's a lot of these kind of online socials and offline socials that have been happening. Where people can just meet other people like them. And what's really nice is there's not a lot of them that happen, but when it happens, it's really fun, because you see an ex-Jehovah's Witness and ex-Muslim meet, and they've never met anyone like each other. And they're like, oh my God, your situation is the same as mine. What the hell? And you get these weird friendships that would never develop otherwise. And I love that. Yeah. For me, that's what's fun, seeing that. Yeah, we used to do some tours in the British Museum where an ex-Jehovah's Witness used to give it as a Jehovah's Witness, where he would say, this is for the Bible, this is for the Bible. He now does it secularly. And I used to go to those, and it's really just fun to see how people mix. Yeah. I think that's the second one, community. And the third one, which is actually growing more and more important and has become one of the core foundational things we do, is training organizations. So we've trained the government, the Met, the defense in the UK. We've trained lots of other charities. We've trained schools, lots of things like that, where we basically train the people who have the guardianship over young people who are vulnerable, apostates, of course, as they have issues with their faith, not to screw them around, because that happens all the time. Like, I remember there's a case of a girl who was underage, and so we couldn't help them. We can't help anyone under 18. We passed them to a charity for children, and she came back going, actually, the charity for children told me to return to my faith.
Wow.
Yeah, really bad. So that's And that's not one-off. That's very common because of the fact that people don't know this problem. It's not that they necessarily were bad intention. They just don't understand what that even means to tell a girl like that, go back to your faith, act like you're religious, you know?
Yeah.
So I think the third thing, and this has been really, really successful, I would say, is the training programs and the kind of institutional work we're doing. It's not as sexy or as out there like the outreach stuff, but actually I believe it's one of the most foundational things you need if you want to change. Because, you know, in this country, we're lucky we have great services. So actually, if the services let you down, you then suddenly don't trust anything. But if you had services that you could go to and they help you out, then you build that safety net that apostates really need.
Great. I mean, I before I got a full-time job in teaching, I was doing some supply work, and I worked in some sort of village church schools. And they could really, really do with some training on some of this stuff.
Yeah. The
conversations in the staff room, I used to just be like, oh my God, you guys.
Exactly. Yeah.
But no, so I mean, I can definitely see why the training aspect would be a major benefit here as well. And you said you train the government, this current government, or
so we've you have to ask the Faithless lead for that. But at the moment, I believe we trained the Metropolitan Police, the MOD, the Ministry of Defense.
Cool.
I think while it was under this current government, yes.
Okay.
I know we've definitely done stuff in the House of Lords and with sort of people in like around the government space. I don't know if we've trained them in that way, but we've definitely have been in meetings with government about apostasy because I've been in some of them.
Okay, interesting. The only reason I bring it up was because I'm sure I read that this is the most disproportionately religious government of any government we've had.
It's been very difficult with this government to get in.
Yeah. But I won't draw you on that too much because it's not part of your remit, really, is it? But so I'll move on to the next question then. So I wanted to ask you. I know I saw this on your website, and obviously this is something that when you guys come and do talks as well, we talk about. But what's some of the advice that you give people who might be doubting their faith at the moment? Perhaps they're just at the stage where, you know, they've just noticed a few things don't make sense, or that the rules don't make sense, or whatever it is, and they're flirting with, you know, maybe just researching a bit more, but they're maybe scared that they're going to go to hell or something, or their community is going to, you know, ostracize them. What advice would you give to people who are at that stage?
Yeah. So I can tell you what I tend to do, because I have maybe my own personal way. The first thing is I calm them down about their thoughts, because one of the things is the worst thing is to think you're crazy. Like that's what happened to me. I just thought I was crazy. Is to say, look, it's okay to doubt. Like doubting is a natural part of it. Even religious people often don't have a problem with doubt as long as you don't leave. You know, they're okay with doubting as long as you don't leave. So the first thing I say is to try to calm them down about the doubt. Like doubt is how we understand things in the world, right? So it's really important to introduce that idea that it's okay, just think, allow your brain to go. And then I think the second thing is to also calm them down about the future. Often the biggest fear is the choices I'm making now in my head are going to lead to things I don't even understand in the future. And there's so much fear built up, particularly in some of these very communal faiths, about what happens if you leave, which, by the way, are actioned. You know, shame culture is a thing, honor violence is a thing. So I think it's also important to address some of those issues they might have. So it's a little bit custom. So let's say if they're a gay man from a Jehovah's Witness background, I would talk to them slightly differently from someone who's a girl from a Muslim background or someone who's a boy from a Muslim background. So that's an important thing. Where I go to after that is also not to try to put any pressure on them to leave. Like people have their own journeys. Like some people, after the first talk I have with them about just giving them the freedom to breathe a little bit, they leave immediately, like within a week. It's quite funny. And then some people, they just keep doubting for a long time, and they become more religious sometimes, even because they become more religious in a liberal way, you know. So there's lots of different paths people can take, and it's very important we don't try to drive, because I'm not interested in that. There's so many people leaving. You don't need anyone to leave, right? There's just
I was going to ask you about that. Yeah. So there's
so
no
many people leaving. Yeah.
What do you say to? I mean, I don't know if you've ever had this accusation, but I'm sure it's been leveled at the humanists before. What do you say to people that just say you're just another, you know, a group that's just trying to indoctrinate people into atheism or humanism or something? How do you respond to that?
For me, it's very simple. I have friends who were ex-religious who are now religious. I have no problem with them. I like to have theological discussions with them, but I have no problem with that at all. In fact, I find it they're more interesting, because I'm like, ooh, why did you do that? you
Yeah,
know?
yeah. Okay.
It doesn't work the other way around. If you're
Yeah.
from a high control religious group, there's no way they're accepting of people who are apostates. That's the problem. And I've seen that myself. Like, I have Muslim friends that knew me when I was religious, but some of them have had to do their own internal journey just to accept me. And then there's been some that were really, really loving and kind, and they could accept me. But it's actually quite rare, actually. If you're religious, it's very hard to accept someone that says, I know what you follow, and I've decided to leave it, because it creates so many of your own internal doubts. Just to answer that question about kind of what else I would recommend, I think one thing that I do a lot of is different people have different needs. So some people have the need of like, what is my life going to look like? What does it look like now? Some people have theological needs, like, how do I think about this? And some people have like more needs about kind of, they just want to live life in a happy way, and the current situation doesn't let them. So there's kind of three types of needs, and you really have to be responsive to what someone's really wanting. So, theology is like the thing I'm really interested in. So I like to get into that. Lots of really nice little questions you can throw, things like that. But most of the time, honestly, it's the it's the how do I live my life stuff that really freaks people out, because you might lose your kids, you might lose your parents, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And one of the quickest things I do is connect them to, let's say, subreddits about apostasy. There's a Reddit ex-Muslim subreddit is really good for that. There's a couple of Facebook groups for Mormons. There's a lot of places you can send people for them to find bigger communities.
Would you? I mean, you've spoken a lot about, obviously, because you're an ex-Muslim. Is Islam the largest group in the UK for which it's the hardest to leave? I've not maybe explained that very well.
I know
Obviously,
what you're saying. I know what you're saying. I would say no. So I would say that Islam is the largest Orthodox bloc, so therefore has the most apostates with problems. But in terms of some of the deepest problems, I would say it's reasonably even between Hasidic Jewish people, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Muslims, because with Muslims, the sliver that are from very Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox almost type backgrounds, which it's even dangerous to leave, there's quite a lot of them, but it's a smaller percentage, I would argue, of the whole Muslim population. There's more integrated population. With Jehovah's Witnesses, if you leave, you have to be cut off. Like, that's a rule.
Yeah. So there's no liberal wing to Jehovah's Witnesses.
No liberal wing, or even a Orthodox but kind of chill wing. There's just none of that. It's very, very solid. With Hasidic, Jewish, and Haredi type communities, again, it's quite a tight-knit community in a way that with Islam, you have that with sort of more Salafi type communities and more like extreme communities. With a lot of the Hasidic communities, you don't see that much breadth, because the wider Jewish community is pretty chill. So, that community has really gone in that direction. So I would say that some of the worst trauma we see is Jehovah's Witness.
Okay, interesting.
Some of the worst trauma I've seen is Jehovah's Witness. And also you've got child abuse stuff in the church. You see huge trauma in the ex-Muslims as well. But because fewer ex-Muslims come from super Orthodox backgrounds, there's more of them in volume, but as a percentage, so many of the XJWs are in trouble. So many. Almost. I haven't really met an XJW that isn't massively traumatized when I've come across them. Like, it's such a hard religion to leave.
Yeah. Well, the few experiences I've had talking to these guys, you get it instantly. The stories are harrowing, like genuinely harrowing. Like you said, it is a cult. It's literally very. So I'll throw this in. I didn't have this written down originally, but I'll throw it in. Do you think there's like a moral imperative then for the rest of us? I know we live in a secular society, and I've always believed that we try to leave one another alone as best as we can, and what we do in our own homes is up to us. But do you think there's an ethical argument for the rest of us checking in on
100%? I think it's a moral imperative, and I would even argue. So think about it like this: we live in a society, and in that society, groups that are far right, even you'd argue far left if you're sort of not with that. Groups that are kind of nationalist, like in a really not nice way, and ultra-Orthodox religious are freaking good at proselytizing. That's what they do. They make it their moral imperative to tell everyone and to do whatever they can to make the world view bigger than it might even be. So it means that the people who are kind of neutral on some of these areas, or even against it, when you're not talking, you're giving them a bigger vacuum of voice than they would have otherwise. So there's a moral imperative to it. I do believe that. And I think this moral imperative applies across almost everything. Of course, we can't be moral, like we can't be perfect morally, or none of us are. We do lots of things that are not right.
Yeah.
But it's about having an open space for discussion. And we're so lucky we have a society we can talk.
Yeah.
So if we don't talk about it, we are part of the problem. I really genuinely believe this.
Yeah.
So, you know, like I'm not massively part of the LGBT community, but I try to be involved one way or the other if I can. And especially in little conversations you have where there's a little bit of homophobia, trying to like deal with that. Why would I do that? Because I don't have a huge bone to pick in that fight. But it's because I really understand how it affects LGBT people. And so I try to get involved. You know, does that make sense?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, I think that's true of anyone who's ever experienced injustice or unfairness. When you see it elsewhere, you're like, oh, I can relate.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, I'm prepared to get involved in that fight.
And to be
as well.
honest, Fate to Faithless is one of the biggest things that we're doing by accident. Is the question you asked in the beginning about, you know, well, most of the UK is pretty chill. Why is it, you know, it's that we have to educate people to say, no, you probably know someone who's going through this or who's gone through this. You just haven't thought about what that means. Because, you know, maybe your mate's girlfriend was from a Muslim background and she had to do this. Or maybe your mate actually was in Mormon. He didn't really want to talk about it. He had left when he was younger, but there's a lot of trauma he carries that you don't know about. Stuff like that. You definitely know people. It's just when you don't look or know what you're looking for, you're never going to find it because it's easy to ignore these things, you know?
Yeah.
So absolutely. It's a moral imperative for all of us. Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, I think we're aligned on that then.
Yeah.
That's
Right.
So I wanted to just end on the sort of faith to faithless stuff before we move on to the next bit. About talking about Humanist UK, because you said at the beginning that faith to faithless is now part of Humanist UK.
Been for a while, yeah. I think we ran it independently for about a year and a half as a founding thing, and then it just got merged in with Humanist UK as part of the.
Okay. So I was going to ask you, what is Humanist UK and what is a humanist for those who may not know?
Yeah, and here's the funny thing: I didn't know what humanist was right at the beginning as well, because when you leave religion, you don't know what, because the Humanist UK at that time was not as good as advertising to apostates that even existed. Yeah. Apostates did their own thing, you know what I mean? Humanist UK was their own thing. And so part of this merger was to try to, for me, with apostates, Humanist UK has such fantastic reach. And I do believe that some of the work they do on the moral philosophy stuff is quite useful for apostates. We don't have to all be humanists, of course, but you know, it's useful. And then flip side, Humanist UK had a huge gap when it came to apostasy. They knew they wanted to do something on it, but they didn't have the mechanisms and stuff. So we brought that in. So it really was a nice marriage.
Yeah.
And you know, Humanist UK, I would say, is one of the oldest kind of humanist organizations in the world. Humanists are, you know, the way I define it is people who try to understand and make their way through the world through sort of moral philosophy and science as their foundational thinking process, with an understanding that we have biases that are evolutionary built into us. You know, so it's kind of this almost as scientific as you can approach to the world, and as morally as you can within the confines of our known weaknesses, if that makes sense. You know, what I like about humanists generally is, and this is all huge generalizations, but one, they can change their mind. You can present them with scientific facts or some moral arguments, and people do go, okay, they do change. And the second thing is that
historically, and is that just quickly, is that does that take a kind of intellectual? Is that an elitist thing?
It's elitist if you haven't spent time in communities that are not elite. So if you're coming from a working class background or from a minority community, you know, there's people like that everywhere in the world. In fact, they often come out from where you don't expect. And I'll give you an example. There was a documentary that I was part of, a radio documentary about ex-Muslims, and they interviewed a random villager in Pakistan, in the middle of a random village in Pakistan, who was an ex-Muslim, right? No one knew that he was an ex-Muslim. And some of the stuff this guy was saying, you could hear this in a humanist debate, you know, like people who are educated in fancy universities, because we have, you know, humans are intellectualism and intelligence is reasonably distributed. It's not like we've got lots of very smart humans and not. We have unfair, you know, class systems and stuff. But actually, some of the best things I've ever heard came from ex-Muslims in Iraq. You know, they spend all their time on YouTube, like looking at theory, and you know, so in a way, they're more hungry in some of these minority communities because they don't have access in the way that some of the wealthier people might do.
Yeah.
So I'd really come back to you on that, because I've heard this argument before, and I'm sure you have as well.
Yeah, of course.
And
Yeah.
I really don't agree. I think, like, I'm not from a elite background.
Sure.
Most apostates are from shit poor backgrounds, right?
Yeah, yeah. I sort of meant more like intellectually elite. So like if you're really secure intellectually, like the people that I know who I've spent a bit of time with who are able to do that kind of, okay, I hadn't
Oh, I
considered that. Fair
understand.
enough. Okay, I've changed my mind. I sort of like highly educated, like almost like professor, like those kind of that kind of very intellectually educated.
Weirdly, I have had different experiences, because
Okay,
my work, so I'm in technology, involves a lot of academics. You'd be surprised.
really,
Actually, the
it's
problem
stubborn.
I find is that if people think they're very smart, they apply that to everything. They might be very smart in chemistry, but they then apply it to everything, including moral philosophy and history and
Okay,
stuff like that.
okay.
And often they just don't have the background or tools to do that. So I have to say, I do find that just because you're an academic or highly educated doesn't mean you're necessarily more flexible in your thinking process,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
would argue.
Interesting. Yeah, interesting.
Maybe there's a generalized difference between the two groups,
Mm,
but I have definitely, I mean, in humanists, you go into a room of humanists, there'll definitely be that crazy guy who's like, and saying stuff, and you
yeah,
can't change his mind that global warming is not a conspiracy. And then
yeah,
there's loads of humanists that like are, but most humanists will agree with global warming. I mean, almost all of them agree that global warming is a problem, but there'll be that one slightly kooky one who just refuses to. So I just go back, like, human groups are reasonably broad in how we think, and the
yeah,
biases occur whether you're more academically intelligent or not, maybe at differing rates, but I see it all everywhere, and I see beauty and intelligence everywhere as well. So I would,
yeah,
I think having money and stability helps you think broader, as
yeah,
we know,
yeah,
this is a well-known fact. But I would say, in terms of apostasy and just being a humanist, um, as a label, it applies to people who are non-elite just as much. It's just that they don't even know what that word means, because the
mm,
advertising for it tends to be in the UK, where we tend to have more of a type of population that's wealthier and stuff.
yeah, yeah. And a lot of people, like some of the older people that I know, who whenever I've used the word, they just assume for some reason it's a cult, humanism.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I know. Yeah, I know. Because it's whenever you say something is an ist, that's why.
It's
Like,
got
it's
an
like
ism in it. Yeah, it's
feminism.
another ism. Oh, okay, it's a
Yeah,
cult. So it's like, okay,
yeah, exactly.
I
Well,
thought.
I mean, because people say the same thing about feminism, or
Yeah, true.
if you're an anti-racist, people can even argue. I mean, some of the anti-racist people I've met are a bit nuts, but generally, if you're an anti-racist, it's chill, but it can come up, like, the word can mean you're part of something and
Yeah,
scary.
yeah,
No.
yeah. I want to go on to something slightly different then, because I saw that you did an interview with LBC about the Batley Grammar School. What's the word? Fiasco? That's not the right
Yeah,
word. But anyway,
yeah,
would you be up for just commenting a
yeah,
little bit on that? Yeah, yeah. Okay, cool.
yeah, sure.
So I wanted to ask you, I mean, when you first saw it, because obviously I'm a school teacher. This is something, and I'm a humanist, so it's something that really, is one of the things that I've wanted to sort of touch on for a little while, and I thought you were a good person to talk to about. What was your initial reaction when you saw the story?
Here we go again. It was just
Yeah.
like,
Okay.
again, and it was like you get the same thematic things happening each time.
Yeah.
There's a mob for hire. There's people with genuine grievances as well. They're two
Yeah.
different things. There's then the institution that freaks out because they don't want to be called something or other.
Mm,
And then there's this whole media kerfuffle where the media also splits everyone, and no one's happy. And the people who lose out is the freaking kids.
mm,
No one
mm,
cares about the kids are the ones who lose out in the end. Like,
yeah.
they're not getting the education they deserve,
Yeah.
and they're being shown that the world is even more childish than they are.
Like South Park,
Yeah,
basically,
yeah,
where the kids are the smart ones.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. It's exactly South Park, and
Mm.
there probably is a South Park episode about something very similar.
There is. I remember they did an episode where they did show Muhammad,
I
and
remember.
then
Yes, I remember the teddy bear.
and then
Yeah,
they censored it. The network censored it. Wouldn't Comedy Central censored it.
yeah, I remember that.
Um, but obviously, like this, so this obviously touches on a lot of different things. And there's this, there's sort of duality in the UK between sort of freedom of speech and freedom of religion, and that clash between what is so sensitive in one religion versus this thing that we call free speech, which where we ought to be able to largely say, almost anything. But I wanted to ask you, the response from the school versus the response from the government was actually very different. And this was something that interested me because I was wondering if the government, which has been banging on about free speech, they've made it their big thing. That the right have really taken free speech, haven't they? The last 10 years or so, and made it their big thing. What they would say, and in fairness to them, I mean, I hate this current government. Again, I won't draw you on this stuff. I absolutely hate them. But I was like, fair play.
Yeah.
You stuck up for what you actually have been claiming you believe in all this time for the last 10 years.
Yeah.
And their response was basically the behavior of the mob outside the school was the problem, not what the teacher taught. But they didn't go as far as to say that teacher as was right. They just said the mob was wrong. So how would you respond to that?
Just to first start with, I'm not afraid of politics. So for me, one of the biggest failures of the left is that free speech, which should be a fundamental and is a fundamental human right, they have not championed. They're very, very uninterested when it comes to anything that's too scary with relationship to their view on identity politics, which is the people who, again, get let down in that are ethnic minorities, because they're the ones who are not able to then have free speech in our communities. So crazy. But yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think this government's response to that, I felt, was reasonably measured. They said enough to clearly state some sort of position. They didn't really take a huge position, though, to be fair. But I felt like, for example, some of the educational institutions were pretty good in terms of their responses, but not all of them. In terms of the school itself, I mean, it obviously freaked out and reacted, right? It was a complete freak out.
Yeah.
And this is a feedback loop, because then the next time this happens and the next time that happens, and if this teacher gets murdered, by the way, yeah, they'll be sad, but people are going to be like, yeah, we're still going to have the same response to this kind of thing again.
It's become hyper normalized, doesn't it?
It's hyper normalized, and it's ridiculous. I mean, let me tell you a little bit about so I did a few media pieces around that time, and I think and I did one. This is quite an angry Muslim guy from that area who's quite well known to be a little bit shouty on this stuff. And, they did something very smart this time. And this shows you that the freedom of speech stuff is slightly winning, though, because they're not talking about freedom of speech anymore versus, freedom of the religion's protection from that. It's safeguarding. That's what a lot of the most smartest responses were. It was, no, this is not about either. You can say what you want. The religion doesn't need to be protected, but it's about the kids. Think about the children. That was the argument. And that means that, because before, that's not what they used to say. They used to say, you should protect the religion. So the public has changed. Even Muslims are changing. I think even Muslims are starting to be like, yeah, this is a bit crazy, that there's a bunch of people who do stupid stuff outside of school, which scares the Muslim parents, by the way. They're the ones who are like, we don't want to take our kids to this mob. So I think that the safeguarding argument was made, and it is a nice microcosm into the fact that the religion stuff is starting to lose when it comes to this topic very slowly.
Yeah, interesting.
And the safeguarding topic makes no sense to me, because obviously we still don't really know what happened in this situation in terms of the context of this. But let's assume the context, which is this was done as an educational tool, not as a way to say to the Muslim kids, look, I don't like you. It was a tool for all the kids in that class with lots of different kinds of blasphemies. The kids need to know this stuff. They need to know that the outside world is full of these kind of controversies, and freedom of speech is a fundamental human right. And therefore, there are certain challenges that come out of that fundamental human right where people feel uncomfortable. And what better time? We have now, as a society, largely accepted that kids should be talking about sex at an early age to protect them from violence, right? Yeah, why are we not protecting them from this kind of violence, that the violence of shunning and of your ability to think being shut down? Yeah, when you do that, you stop people becoming far-right extremists or religious extremists. You prevent extremism when you have debate. And I gave an example to the person I was speaking to on the call, and he couldn't really answer it, which was, I grew up I went to a school that had a lot of people who ended up UKIP and EDL and all that, right? Particularly EDL. There's a lot of working class white kids, very disenfranchised, more than the Asian community in that area, and I saw that my eyes. If a teacher in that school were to show things that were offensive, like Churchill being actually quite a colonialist type person and being very, very racist around certain things to those kids, there would definitely be complaints from the parents, because they would be like, oh, our grandparents fought in World War II and stuff like that. Do I think that that's okay to then stop that teacher and maybe even sack him? Of course not. I would say you prevent far-right extremism by allowing debate.
Yeah.
Why is that? Why are these two different things?
Well, I was so this is something that I've been thinking about, right? So just to give you an anecdote as a way into it, we were teaching Of Mice and Men in English last term. And in it, they use the N words, comes up a lot. And I said to the students, look, I don't feel comfortable using the N word, so I'm just going to substitute the N word for literally N word. Okay. Or I'll just gloss over it altogether and just not say it. And they, to every single student that I taught, said the same thing to me. We're not comfortable using it. We don't want to use it. And I was expecting some of them, to push the boundaries and to shock tactics, and maybe to get a bit of control. They would just do it, bit of a laugh or whatever, or just to test it. And even when we had no minority ethnic students in the class, when we were doing sessions, because I was doing breakout rooms and stuff, they still wouldn't use that word, because they understood the power of it to offend. They knew it was so taboo, the word. And I think they all kind of agreed as well that it was almost unique in the kind of English lexicon. Like it's But so I wonder then, because this is something I was thinking about, does this apply to the depiction of Muhammad within the Islamic community? Is it so taboo?
It is, but the Shias draw Muhammad all the time. There's a historic art from Shia culture drawing Muhammad. They have no problem drawing it.
Do they still do it now, today?
Yeah, they have like imams and I mean, there's still drawings of Muhammad. The Shia are a very different group to the Sunnis. So just be very, very clear what we're talking about. We're talking about a group within. We're talking about a sect or a larger sect within thing. The Shias will obviously disagree with the Muhammad cartoon, so that's a different thing. But there is drawing. So just drawing is not acceptable in the Sunni sect. But beyond that, obviously, blasphemy is extremely concrete as a concept within Islam. So there's a lot of taboo, but the taboo is right down to the root of theology, all the way up to like how Islam in recent times has become more radicalized and stuff as well. So it's a kind of quite a dense topic to cover. Is it like the N-word? Hell no. Islam was a very powerful empire. They're very different things. The Arab Islam Empire was one of the most powerful empires in all of time. It is not, it's like the British Empire. There was no difference in terms of they had their own slaves. Do you know what I mean? So the word abd is slave. They still use the word abd in places in the Middle East to describe black people. Do you know what I mean? It's quite bad. This is not about Islam really, but just to give you an example, like the Arab Islam Empire and the Islamic kind of faith as a large followed religion is not in a weak position in society over time. It doesn't have that historical baggage that African-American slaves and just African people have related directly to the N-word. So I think they're very important to contextualize these two things.
Yeah, in that sense, I totally agree with you. But so just if I just because I haven't fully spoken about this to anyone, so I'm kind of thinking it through as I'm saying it. But this was my initial thinking when I was reading Of Mice and Men with the kids, and then when this came up, that was my first thought was, well, look, as a school teacher and as a class, we've kind of decided almost independently of one another that it's such a taboo thing and it has such a power to offend that we're not going to say it. So is it not also inappropriate, therefore, for us to show depictions of Muhammad? Perhaps we can describe the image, but does it not also have the same kind of propensity to offend? And therefore, is it not on us as individuals to say it's so offensive to this community that we're not prepared to do it on an ethical basis?
So just to be clear, I don't think even the N-word can be not said by everyone under every context. I think it can.
Well, yeah, in some contexts.
In fact, it is. It is. There are comedians who are not black who say it. It's very, very context dependent on when you're saying it.
Yeah.
If I was reading a text and the N-word isn't there, I would be comfortable saying N-word or the actual word. I have done both.
Yeah.
But that's only in the context where the people around me are comfortable with that.
Yeah.
Right. So just to be very, very clear,
Yeah.
even in that example, which is a 10,000 times more extreme than the specific context we're talking about with this depiction of Muhammad, even then I think that there should not be a complete moratorium where I could be like hunted down or whatever, like what's happening in Batley, right?
No,
So
of course. Yeah. Yeah.
And then when you look at the cartoons, so context does matter, but also, I mean, I do think there's a fundamental freedom to be able to say what you want, even if it offends, even if it's the N-word. I do actually believe in that. But beyond that, in terms of as a society, the soft power that these things have, which you're talking about, I think there's a difference because, look, like I don't wear shirts with the cartoon of Muhammad with a bomb in his head because, yeah, it's not really my thing. I do find it offensive. Of course, I mean, it's meant to offend. Of course, it's offensive, but it also doesn't achieve what I'm trying to do, right? Would I show that on a slide? Hell yeah, I would have no problem showing that on a slide because the intention of that slide is I'm going to educate on something. They're two different things, right? So, I mean, same thing with the N-word. Like, if I'm just going around saying it all the time, the intention of that is very different from me having a discussion with someone about the violence of that word and the history of that word. Then can I say it? I do think I should be able to say it, but obviously it really is context dependent.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of nuance in this, but the important thing is they're incomparable, I believe.
Yeah. Okay.
Context.
Okay. So the school, just to anyone listening, just if they're unfamiliar with what happened, a school teacher, 29-year-old Yorkshireman in West Yorkshire, Batley Grammar School, he was teaching an RE lesson. This is what I've read about blasphemy, and he included one of the images of the Charlie Hebdo cartoon of Muhammad with a bomb on his head or something. I haven't actually seen the image myself, but and then what happened was a big group of protesters outside came and demanded he be fired. He wasn't sacked. He was suspended, wasn't he, pending an investigation?
Yeah, he was suspended. Yeah, I don't think they can sack him. If they sack him, they're gonna get sued to high hell.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and but he's been under police protection, including his wife and kids, and also his parents, who he doesn't even live with. They've also gone on. So for me, this is absolutely bonkers. That and obviously there was I've forgotten his name now. Samuel Paty, wasn't there, in France, who was beheaded after showing a school teacher in France who was beheaded after showing a similar image, or maybe it was the same image, because one of the students in his school had basically grassed him up and said, "Oh, he was showing this image."
She had, by the way, lied about it,
and she's been shown. Well, she's been reported to have lied about it. Yeah. So it's not that he's overreacting in going into police hiding, and
no,
there's a very
this guy will have to do this his whole life. He's gone for something he probably had no intention of causing hurt with. You know, he was trying to educate, I believe, because I think that he's not the only person who's been in this kind of sticky situation. It's horrible, and it's a testament to how childish we still are about these things. And to be honest, I do think some of this stems from this kind of lowest common denominator, like racism of lower expectations type of thing. You would not accept this from the far right.
No,
we would not accept it. We would not accept from the far right. And this has happened before. There was I was invited on a BBC talk because I think it was in a school. Oh, they were teaching Islam in a school in one of the RE classes, and the parents pulled their kids out saying, we don't want our kids to learn Islam. And I got called in partly because the media thought somehow I'd be like, yeah, that's great, right? And I was like, this is disgusting. This is disgusting. We need to teach our children about religion. As a non-believer, I'm not afraid that they're going to get indoctrinated if they have the ability to think.
Yeah,
that's all I want.
Yeah, of course.
So in that situation, we're all up in arms, like, look at these racist parents and this and that. In this situation where you've got a mob outside scaring all the Muslim parents, by the way, and putting huge fear into these kids, and then trying to get this and this poor teacher is now afraid of his life, and his whole family is now gone.
Yeah.
Right? We are okay with it. Why? What is the difference between that and the situation where white parents were putting the kids out? You tell me. And I don't like to play race as a concept all the time because it isn't always the primary driving factor for situations. But in this, I spent too much time in my life having people look at you differently and treat you differently than what you'd be treating, James, because I'm assumed to come with certain cultural baggage.
Yeah.
This
Yeah.
racism of lower expectation. I'm supposed to be more ethnic and cultured and religious and, orthodox and more homophobic and more sexist. It's an assumption, and it's such a bad thing on the left because, especially ethnic minorities, we grow up more on the left because we're from lower class and income backgrounds usually. And it's often that grouping of people that are often the worst towards people like me. Yeah. And it's time and time again, and it's across the world. It's in America, it's here, it's just really, really horrible. Weirdly, it's not like that in a lot of these Muslim countries, because the lefty people in these Muslim countries are often atheists or communists. So there's quite a funny thing where they're quite anti-religious, actually.
Yeah, that is strange, isn't it?
Yeah.
I can sort of see why the left have got to this stage, because to this place, because I guess their motivation is they want to protect and be in solidarity with communities that are, being persecuted often by the right or whoever in society. So their instinct is to be protective, I guess. But like, you're totally right. There is this problem of racism of lower expectations and everything you just mentioned.
I'm going to add to you. I completely agree with you. So personally, I tend to be closer to people with liberal, more lefty values for that reason, because there's a fundamental difference sometimes in how they perceive how the world should work, but not always. Like the right, I have friends in the right as well. But the other thing is, when the left and the right, to be honest, start to accept minorities, including religious minorities and ethnic minorities, as a wider pluralistic group, you get richer communities. So like in Canada, a lot of the Sikh community is much more integrated than even here. And here they're pretty integrated. But we have huge issues with honor violence still here, because back in the day, if you talk about honor violence, they'd say, we don't talk about it, it's racist, And it took the charity Carmen Nirvana 10 years to make it until there was a law about honor violence, right? Right. But in Canada, because there's, for whatever structural and reasons, the Sikh community is much more diversely accepted in the society. You can be religious, you can be non-religious. It's a little bit more, I think you have a richer community that I would argue than, the UK is really starting to move, and this is obviously me speaking from what I know, but you get a richness that comes with political spectrums, understanding diversity within the minorities. And that's where you get the minority community is really growing and really, becoming such rich places. And we just don't have that in the UK as we should. We just do not have that richness, because we box people so hard. We love boxing them.
I think it's partly, these days, I just feel like we're so divided as a country that you just have to conform to you're in groups, you're in group, and you're in the trenches all the time. You haven't got time to...
I completely agree. And, it's something I think about a lot, because I think sometimes about, if I'm saying these things about political groups that I generally be aligned with, which I am, I tend to vote like Lib Dem or Labour generally. If I'm talking about them, am I giving voice to the more extreme right-wing groups, or even the Conservative Party, where I don't always agree with them, but for me, so you have to always play a game, right, in your head. Who am I talking to? I'm talking to you. So I understand you're more lefty. So it's a little bit of where we can have a shared understanding that we're not far right. We can have a shared understanding. Probably even some of our social and economic values are more on the left, but we want the left to do better, and therefore this conversation makes more sense than a conversation about how we don't like the right. If that makes sense. So it's more like the love for your spectrum is driving the criticism of said spectrum.
And I think that's really healthy. That's something that we're sort of getting away from what we were originally talking about, but I'll bring us back in a sec. But this is my fear of populism and nationalism has meant that my criticism of my own side, I've sort of dialed that way down and tried to, even though I'm a Lib Dem, and I think the Lib Dems are doing just nothing right now, but I don't criticize them too much. And I massively want Labour to get in, but I've not been massively impressed with Keir Starmer. But even still, I don't criticize them too much, because the focus, in my view, needs to be taking down the biggest threat, which is populism and nationalism and the Trumpism.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that's problematic, because it just means that we end up not having the tough conversations on our side.
But to be honest,
or if it does happen, it's usually like Momentum that has it,
yeah,
and they've got
yeah.
their own agenda, and then, that
exactly.
skews it.
But James, I would argue that, you know, as someone who clearly cares a lot, like you working internally to try to make sure that the conversations have your voice on the left side is how we get rid of populism. Because one of the reasons you have populism and this sort of current divisiveness is because one side gets trenched up. And the truth is, like in my truth, so just from my experience, a lot of the left are really horrible with these issues, to be honest, because it's a surprise for me when I come across someone like you, to be honest. Right? It's that bad.
Really?
The amount of people on the left that I see that are so forgiving of some of these issues, right? And therefore they don't have a foundational structure of like, you know, your values are more reactive to rather than like intrinsic foundations in yourself. And I'll give you an example of this. When there was the last the election which Corbyn lost on, I was with a bunch of people, mostly quite lefty, like writers and these mostly centrist actually, but a lot of lefty type people. And two of their kids came in, and they'd been canvassing for Corbyn the whole day. We started having a chat, and I remember that they were really shocked that I didn't vote Corbyn, because they assumed me being brown, I would vote Labour. That was generally what I thought they were thinking. And then when I explained it's because of some of the kind of relationships Corbyn had with groups like MEND and more extremist groups that come and cause problems in my community, there was a massive backpedaling, you know, in terms of, oh, but you know, it's about power structures and stuff. And I said to them, we just had a conversation about how power structures shouldn't matter what I said to them is, that's only sensible when the power structure is one that you understand and you care about. Because the power structure here is that in my community, the power structures are these Islamists. It's not the government so much, it's the Islamists. They're very powerful and they create problems. So when Corbyn works with them or has any kind of lifting up of them, you're reinforcing a power structure in my community. Yeah. And this is something you hear time and time again, where people are like, it's about power structures, but they use it as a cover to ignore the power structure, that there's a more complicated power structure relationship within these minority communities with the wider, because we're often quite secluded. We're not exactly perfectly integrated into wider British culture and society, right? For lots of reasons, historic reasons.
That's actually a really good criticism, and it's something that I think not too many white people like me will have really considered. And I'm totally with you on the, particularly the. I mean, I did criticize Corbyn and what I used to call the cult of Corbyn a lot.
Sure.
Because I did just think it was cult-like in behavior at times. It was special pleading. It was
couldn't lead,
protect the Messiah at any
lead,
cost. And there was a lot of blinkered people, I thought, on the left under Corbyn. And you're right. So the left is in disarray, but we've kind of gone off from Batley Grammar School
a
little bit.
Yeah, exactly.
I'll bring us back just because I had one other thing that I wanted to ask you. Do you think that it's an Islamic problem in particular, this thing? Because obviously you can show depictions of any other deity, more or less, and you're not going to I could take, you know, I could share that painting of, what was it called, Pish Jesus, that or whatever it was, that really offensive thing. Any other prophet or deity I could get away with, but I wouldn't share an image of Prophet Muhammad because I'm a coward and I don't want to be chased, you know. Sure. And I found this with the same, you know, with like the Telegraph and the Express and all these right-wing groups that bang on about freedom of speech. They'll support those who have the courage to do it, but they won't do it themselves. And so this is.
I would say there are certain specific challenges that theologically that make it particularly bad for Islam, but it's not an Islamic thing, and I'll tell you why. If you go to India and you go into a far-right Hindutva area and you start sharing a picture of anything that's related to Hinduism that's protected, you're going to get murdered, or there's a risk of death.
Yeah.
Right. And if you go to a evangelical Christian area in a developing country that has violence, again, you could get killed.
Yeah.
Right. And in the West, I think Islam has a more specific problem because somehow a lot of these Western social spheres and political spheres have protected Islamic blasphemy over other blasphemies. So, they don't do anything if you're, if you showed an image of Krishna in a blasphemous way, they wouldn't really do anything. They wouldn't do anything, actually. They wouldn't do it for Jesus, but they would do it for Muhammad because of the protection for Islamic blasphemy that these Western governments and institutions have provided. And it's just gotten to that position. But globally speaking, it's not an Islam only problem, for sure. Because again, like I said, I mean, there was a big hiss up recently because one of the deities in the Hindu faith, someone did a drawing of her in a compromising kind of picture, and there was like death threats and huge campaigns and stuff like that from the Hindu. So I would just argue that political and religious extremism is globalized.
Yeah.
But we have a very specific problem with Islam.
Yeah.
In mostly Western countries.
Yeah. And do you think there's anything to do with the fact that like Saudi Arabia is so oil rich? And I remember when like you had the issue with the in Sweden, or was it in Denmark, where there was all like Indonesia and like heads of state were saying, oh, we're going to pull out of our trade with tiny little Denmark. And I was looking at this and thinking, bloody hell, all that's happened is the Danish government has defended, like, I can't remember, was it a writer or?
Yeah. I remember. Yeah.
And now like the Danish economy is at risk. And I'm just thinking, wow, that is massive. But you wouldn't get that with.
No.
India wouldn't do it, for instance, or would they?
Yes, they would. They've done it. There's things like that happening right now. Yeah. They're becoming more and more sensitive to stuff like that because the government is going more right wing.
Yeah.
And no, absolutely. You can do a bit of Googling. It's heading in that direction with India. It's quite scary.
Okay.
I would say that I will take what you've asked and take it a lot further. This has been going on for decades. So the UK mosques are not Salafi traditionally, or that, like, they're not extreme in that way. They're mostly like Deobandi, which is a kind of like a sort of a Pakistani sort of slightly Sufi-ish sect. They have lots of problems, but they're not the Saudi brand of extremism. Until Saudi started funding.
Very, very quickly, just for anyone listening, I'm fairly sure I know the difference between Sufi and Salafist. Very different traditions in Islam. One's much more spiritual and sort of peaceful, and one's much more.
The Sufis can be kind of crazy.
Okay. I'm going off of
Sufism as a theological construct is a lot more spiritual and internalized.
Yeah,
but the way it's practiced is very diverse, and in some cases it can be quite problematic, just like and extreme. Salafi is more orthodox Sunni Islam and tends to be much more orthodox in practice, and can obviously go very, very extreme.
And very conservative.
Very conservative, yeah. But Sufis can be very conservative as well, by the way, just to be very, very clear.
Yeah.
So now what's happened is, traditionally, Deobandis and Sufis are not really in with the Saudi type of Islam. They're really even sometimes enemies. But a lot of the mosques in the UK were for a long time funded by some of the Gulf money. And there was a lot of like donations in other ways given from there. And it slowly moved a lot of them into that direction. And so a lot of these problems are because of economic powers and political interests, and also our relationship in the UK with the UK government, with Saudi Arabia and all that, and the fact that we've turned a blind eye on it for a long time, and what it's done to the local the region as well, and that Iran war with Saudi, all of that stuff, if you add it all together, has led to a softening of how the British government and how Western countries deal with some of this extremism stuff. And then obviously you got terrorism and all that, which has allowed it to be pushed back a little bit. But it's just created this weird situation where we protect blasphemy in this country when it comes from Muslims. And blasphemy, yeah.
At the top, partly because of the wealth of those countries coming.
Partly because of the relationships we have, partly because of the power that's there, partly because of the and one of the reasons that you get these extreme responses to blasphemy is because they've been funding a lot of the institutions in our communities that
Yeah.
historically were not this extreme. The difference in the Bangladeshi community in Italy that are Muslims with the Bangladeshi community in London, in the UK, is night and day.
Really?
Night and day. They come here and they're like, you're crazy. Genuinely. The difference between the Algerian Muslims in France, well, actually, France is a complicated situation because they've got their own problems. The difference between Algerians from Algeria and Algerians from UK, very different. Again, they often come here and they think, oh, these are my crazy cousins. The difference between the Egyptians who live in Egypt and the Egyptians here in the UK, again, can be very different. I've got a close family friend who are Egyptians, and they call the cousins here the crazy cousins. They don't
because of the influence of Saudi.
Partly, yeah, big way. Yeah. Why is it that so much of ISIS fighters were exports from the West? So in terms of travel, obviously a lot of the Muslim countries had a lot of that, but we did as well. Why? That wasn't traditionally the case. Most of us didn't have family members who were like wearing niqab and stuff like that, the full face covering and stuff. It's a very recent phenomenon. So it's important for people to understand this, because Islam isn't and hasn't ever been a monolith in time.
No, of course. Yeah.
But with money, you can make anything go in a certain direction.
Yeah.
With money and political power, you can do anything. Yeah. And you see this again with India. Hinduism is such an old and diverse religion, and yet why are you seeing this far-right Hindutva push? What is happening there? Right? So I think these are the things that I find very interesting, and they're very useful to add color to these debates.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Well, thanks so much for your time, Imtiaz. It's been a really interesting conversation. Yeah, I hope
very, very good questions.
Yeah. Well, I hope anyone listening to this, if you're interested in Faith to Faithless, have a look at their website. What's the best place to go if they're looking to?
Best is actually to go on YouTube and look for Faith to Faithless for the videos, and also to go on the Humanist UK website, and we've got like a Faith to Faithless link there somewhere.
Brilliant. Yeah. Okay. I'll put all the links in the post when I put it up. Awesome. Imtiaz, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, James.